alien Empress laughed at the human's primitive weapon until he killed her champion. The atmosphere in the great spire was thick with the scent of sterile coolant, and the metallic tang of the energy shields hummed against the stone walls. Arthur stood at the center of the obsidian-slick arena, his fingers tracing the cold, utilitarian steel of the rifle slung over his shoulder. High above on the floating dais, Empress Phasma leaned back in her throne, her skin a shimmering shade of pale violet that caught the artificial light of the hall. She looked down at him with a smirk that was both beautiful and patronizing, her eyes glowing with a faint, bioluminescent gold. She gestured toward her champion, a towering mass of bioengineered muscle and shimmering hard light armor. The Empress laughed, the sound like breaking glass, as she remarked on the absurdity of a species bringing chemical propellant slugs to a duel of molecular displacement. Arthur did not blink, his gaze fixed on the Empress, his posture relaxed despite the massive threat looming before him. He shifted his weight, his boots scuffing the polished floor, and felt the familiar weight of the weapon that the Empress had just mocked. "I find your confidence amusing, human," Phasma said, her voice echoing through the chamber. "It is not confidence, Your Majesty," Arthur replied, his voice a low, steady rumble. "It is physics," he added, his thumb flicking the safety catch of his rifle. The champion roared, a sound that vibrated in Arthur's chest, and charged forward with a speed that blurred the air. Arthur did not retreat. Instead, he dropped to one knee, the movement fluid and practiced. He tracked the glowing core of the champion's chest, the point where the hard light emitters were most concentrated. With a single, sharp exhale, he pulled the trigger, and the roar of the rifle drowned out the ambient hum of the spire. The tungsten spike, accelerated to hypersonic speeds by a simplified magnetic coil, tore through the air and impacted the champion's chest. The hard light armor didn't just break, it shattered into a million refracting shards as the kinetic energy transferred through the creature's body. The champion collapsed, the force of the impact skidding its massive form back across the arena floor until it lay still at the base of Phasma's dais. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the thin wisp of smoke rising from Arthur's barrel. Phasma's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of genuine, wide-eyed shock as she stared at the wreckage of her invincible warrior. She stood up, her long, elegant fingers gripping the edge of her throne so hard the metal groaned. Arthur stood slowly, slinging the rifle back over his shoulder, his eyes never leaving hers. "Primitive," he said, his tone devoid of malice but heavy with a new kind of authority. "But effective," he concluded, his gaze sweeping over the silent alien court. Phasma descended from her dais, her movements no longer regal but prowling, like a predator that had finally found something worthy of its attention. She stopped just inches from him, her height nearly matching his, the scent of her skin, a mix of crushed lilies and something electric, filling his senses. She reached out, her fingers hovering just over the rough fabric of his tactical vest, her breath hitching in her throat. "How?" she whispered, her golden eyes searching his face for a sign of deception. "Mass times acceleration," Arthur answered, his voice dropping an octave as he stepped closer, closing the remaining gap between them. The tension in the room shifted from political to something far more visceral, a spark jumping between them that had nothing to do with weaponry. Phasma's hand finally made contact with his chest, her palm flat against his heart, feeling the steady, powerful thrum of his pulse. She tilted her head back, her lips parting as she looked at the man who had just dismantled her world's perceived superiority. "You humans are far more dangerous than we calculated," she murmured, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Arthur's hand came up, his fingers wrapping around her wrist, his grip firm and possessive. He didn't pull her away. Instead, he guided her hand higher, until her fingertips brushed against his neck. "We are full of surprises," Arthur said, his eyes darkening as he leaned in until their foreheads touched. The Empress didn't recoil. She leaned into him, her body molding against the hard lines of his frame. The court was forgotten, the politics of the border colony a distant memory as the raw, physical magnetism of the moment took over. "Show me more of this human ingenuity," Phasma commanded, her voice a low, sultry challenge. Arthur's other hand found the small of her back, pulling her flush against him, the heat of her body seeping through his uniform. "As you wish, Empress," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. He led her away from the arena, toward the private chambers of the spire, his stride confident and unhurried. The guards stepped aside, sensing the change in their ruler's demeanor, a mixture of fear and awe at the human who had tamed the Empress's scorn. Inside the darkened sanctum, the walls were lined with shifting holographic displays of the galaxy, but neither of them looked at the stars. Phasma turned to face him as the doors hissed shut, her violet skin flushed with a deeper hue of excitement. She began to unfasten the intricate clasps of her ceremonial armor, her eyes locked onto his, demanding he watch every movement. "I have never felt a force so blunt," she said, her armor clattering to the floor. "It lacks the elegance of our technology, but it has a weight I cannot ignore," she added, stepping out of the last of her gear. Arthur watched her, his expression unreadable but his body taut with restrained desire. He began to strip off his own gear, the heavy boots, the vest, the shirt, revealing a body mapped with scars from a dozen different worlds. Phasma's eyes traveled over every mark, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch a jagged line across his ribs. "Each one is a lesson in survival," Arthur explained, his voice gravelly. She stepped into his space, her hands sliding up his arms to his shoulders, her skin feeling like silk against his rougher texture. She marveled at the density of his muscles, the sheer physical presence he commanded without the aid of augmentations. "You are so solid," she breathed, her lips grazing his collarbone. Arthur groaned, his hands finding her hips and lifting her, her legs wrapping instinctively around his waist. He backed her against the cold stone wall, the contrast between the chilled rock and the fire of their skin making her gasp. "You wanted to see how we operate," Arthur said, his kisses trailing down her neck. "We don't just use kinetic energy in our weapons, Phasma," he whispered against her skin. He moved with a deliberate, slow intensity, his hands exploring the curves of her body with a tactile hunger that overwhelmed her. Phasma had spent her life surrounded by the sterile, the ethereal, and the digital. This was something entirely different. This was sweat, heat, and the sound of skin on skin, a primitive symphony that spoke to a deeper part of her biology. She arched her back, her fingers digging into his shoulders as he claimed her mouth in a kiss that was deep and demanding. There was no telepathic link, no shared data stream, just the raw, unadulterated sensation of being wanted by a man who had conquered her pride. The hours blurred as the ship's internal cycle shifted, the light in the room dimming to a deep, nocturnal blue. They lay tangled together on the oversized furs of her bed, the Empress of 1,000 worlds resting her head on the chest of a human soldier. Phasma traced the patterns of his veins, fascinated by the complexity of his biology, so different from her own, yet perfectly compatible in this shared heat. "The council will demand to know what happened in the arena," she said, her voice soft and drowsy. "Tell them the champion fell to a superior force," Arthur replied, his arm draped over her, pulling her closer. "They won't understand," she sighed, shifting so she could look into his eyes. "They see the universe as a series of equations to be solved with light and frequency," she continued. "Then show them the results," Arthur said, his hand sliding down to her thigh, his touch reigniting the spark between them. The next morning, the negotiation room was tense, the human delegation sitting opposite the Valyrian High Command. Phasma sat at the head of the table, her expression unreadable, her posture regal once more, though those who knew her noticed a new glow to her skin. Arthur stood behind the human ambassador, his gaze neutral, though his eyes met Phasma. For a fraction of a second, a silent acknowledgement of the night before. The Valyrians were pushing for heavy concessions, citing their technological superiority as a reason for the humans to yield the resource-rich moons of the border. "Your weapons are loud and messy," one of the Valyrian generals sneered, looking at the data from the duel. It was a fluke of environmental variables, he dismissed. Phasma stood up, the movement silencing the room instantly. She walked to the center of the chamber, projecting a recording of the duel onto the main screen. "It was not a fluke," she stated, her voice carrying a weight that brooked no argument. The human did not use a complex algorithm or a subspace frequency. She explained, her eyes sweeping over her shocked generals. He used the fundamental laws of the universe to deliver a physical truth that our shields could not compute, she said, gesturing toward Arthur. The generals muttered among themselves, but Phasma silenced them with a sharp look. She turned to the human ambassador, her gaze softening slightly. Humanity has a mastery of the tangible world that we have long forgotten, she declared. We will not be taking the moons, she announced, shocking both sides of the table. Instead, we will be forming a joint protectorate, Phasma proposed. The human ambassador, a man named Noah, looked at Arthur in confusion, but Arthur simply nodded. The deal was struck, the most favorable terms humanity had ever received from an elder species. As the meeting broke up, Phasma approached Arthur once more, the professional mask slipping just enough for him to see the hunger underneath. The protectorate will require a permanent human liaison, she said, her voice low enough only for him to hear. I'll need to oversee the training of your new kinetic defense squads, Arthur replied, a small smile playing on his lips. Phasma leaned in, her scent once again threatening to undo his composure. I look forward to your intensive training methods, she whispered. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity as the two species began to integrate their technologies. Arthur spent his days in the training grounds, teaching the Valyrian soldiers how to account for windage, gravity, and the raw power of mechanical force. He was a demanding teacher, his presence imposing and his expectations high, earning the respect of the alien warriors who had previously looked down on him. At night, he returned to Phasma's quarters, where the roles were reversed, and the Empress explored the depths of human passion with an insatiable curiosity. She found that the more she learned about him, the more she realized that humanity's true strength wasn't in their guns, but in their resilience and their capacity for deep, physical connection. One evening, while they stood on the balcony overlooking the sprawling capital city, Phasma watched a fleet of human freighters landing at the spaceport. Your people move with such purpose, she remarked, her hand resting on Arthur's arm. We don't have the luxury of eternal life like some of the older races, Arthur said, looking out at the sunset. We have to make every moment count, especially the ones that matter, he added, turning to her. Phasma felt a pang of something she hadn't experienced in centuries, a sense of urgency. She pulled him into a kiss that tasted of longing and a newfound appreciation for the fleeting nature of time. Then do not waste another second, she urged, her hands finding the hem of his shirt. The conflict was not entirely over, however. A faction of Valyrian traditionalists, led by a general named Victor, viewed the alliance as a contamination of their pure society. They launched a coup, seizing the central command of the spire while Phasma and Arthur were together in the private gardens. The sound of energy blasts echoed through the tranquil space, and the golden shields of the palace flickered and died. They're coming for the throne, Phasma said, her hand going to the ceremonial dagger at her waist. Not if I have anything to say about it, Arthur replied, reaching into a hidden compartment in a stone bench and pulling out a compact, high-velocity pistol. He moved with a tactical grace that Phasma found intoxicating even in the face of danger. They navigated the palace corridors, Arthur taking point and neutralizing the rebels with clinical efficiency. He didn't use flashy energy bolts. He used suppressed rounds that found the gaps in the rebels' armor with terrifying accuracy. Phasma watched him work, the way his body coiled and snapped with every movement, a master of the physical realm. They reached the throne room, where Victor stood over the fallen bodies of the royal guard, his hand hovering over the activation sequence for the orbital strike. You would see us play with mud dwellers, Phasma. Victor spat, his eyes filled with rage. I would see us evolve, Victor, Phasma replied, her voice steady. Arthur stepped out from the shadows, his pistol aimed at the general's head. Step away from the console, Arthur ordered, his voice echoing in the large hall. Victor laughed. A harsh, grating sound. You think that toy can stop me before I level your colony? He challenged. I don't think I know, Arthur said. Before Victor could react, Arthur fired, but not at the general. He shot the power conduit above the console, the heavy lead slug severing the main line and sending a shower of sparks over the equipment. The console died, and the room was plunged into emergency lighting. Phasma seized the moment, lunging forward with her dagger and pinning the stunned general to the floor. Arthur moved in to assist, his boots heavy on the stone, his presence ending any hope of further resistance. The coup was crushed within the hour. The loyalist forces rallied by the sight of their empress standing tall alongside her human champion. In the aftermath, the bond between the two species was solidified by blood and shared victory. Phasma stood before her people, her hand intertwined with Arthur, publicly declaring him her consort and the defender of the realm. "We have seen the power of the old ways," she told the assembly. "And we have seen the strength of the new," she continued, her eyes finding Arthur. "Humanity is not a primitive race to be mocked, but a partner to be embraced," she declared. The celebrations lasted for days, a fusion of Valyrian light festivals and human revelry. Arthur found himself at the center of it all, a hero to both sides, though he only had eyes for one person. He found Phasma in the quiet of the royal library, away from the noise and the politics. She was dressed in simple, soft robes, her violet skin glowing in the candlelight as she pored over a book of human history. "Are you learning our secrets?" Arthur asked, stepping into the room. "I am trying to understand how a species so focused on the physical can be so capable of such profound emotion," she said, closing the book. "It's not a secret," Arthur said, walking toward her. "It's just who we are," he added, taking her hands in his. He pulled her up from her seat, the heat between them building instantly, a familiar and welcome fire. He began to undo the silk ties of her robe, his fingers nimble and sure. "I want to know everything," Phasma whispered, her eyes dark with passion. "I want to feel the weight of your world," she breathed, her body pressing against his. Arthur didn't answer with words. He lifted her onto the heavy wooden table, the ancient scrolls scattering to the floor. He showed her the depth of human love, a force that was as unrelenting and powerful as the kinetic slugs he used in battle. It was a dance of friction and gravity, a physical manifestation of the alliance they had built. Phasma cried out his name, the sound echoing through the halls of history, a testament to the bridge they had built between their worlds. The story of the human consort and the Empress became a legend, told across the stars as a reminder of what happens when two different strengths unite. Arthur and Phasma ruled together for decades, their union producing a new generation that carried the best of both species. The border colony flourished, becoming a hub of innovation where human mechanics met Valyrian energetics. And always, at the heart of the empire, the memory of a single gunshot in a quiet arena remained. A symbol of the day, a primitive, human proved that the physical world still held the ultimate power. As they aged, the passion between them never faded, only grew deeper and more complex. They would often return to the balcony where they first looked at the stars together, Arthur's hand always finding hers. "Do you ever regret it?" Arthur asked one evening, his hair now streaked with gray. "Regret meeting the man who broke my champion and stole my heart?" Phasma asked, a playful glint in her golden eyes. "Never," she answered, leaning into him. "You taught me that there is beauty in the blunt and strength in the simple," she added. "And I taught you that humans are very good at hitting things," Arthur joked, kissing her forehead. Phasma laughed, the sound warm and full of life. "Yes, you are," she agreed, her hand sliding down to his waist. "Especially the right targets," she whispered, her eyes promising another night of exploration. The galaxy continued to spin, empires rose and fell, but the legacy of Arthur and Phasma endured. They were the proof that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't their technology, but their ability to connect, to love, and to impress even the most cynical of alien minds with their raw, unyielding humanity. Their story was written in the stars, a romantic epic that began with a laugh and ended with a galaxy-spanning peace, fueled by the kinetic energy of two souls who refused to be kept apart by the vastness of space. In the final years of their reign, a new threat emerged from the void, a swarm of entities that existed beyond the physical plane. The Valyrian technology was useless against them, their light shields passing through the entities like ghosts. The council panicked, but Arthur remained calm, his tactical mind already finding the solution. They interact with the physical world to feed, he observed, watching the sensor data. If they can touch us, we can touch them, he reasoned. He developed a system of high-density particulate clouds, essentially kinetic smoke, that gave the entities a physical form that could be targeted. It was another simple, human solution to a complex alien problem. Phasma led the fleet, her ships equipped with the new human-designed dispensers, and they drove the entities back into the dark. "You saved us again," Phasma said, returning to the palace after the victory. "We saved us," Arthur corrected, helping her out of her flight suit. "It's the human way," he said with a wink. "We never give up on the things we love," he added, pulling her into a tight embrace. Phasma held on to him, feeling the strength of his arms, the same strength that had held her through decades of peace and war. She realized then that Arthur was right. It wasn't just physics or mass. It was the human spirit, a kinetic force of nature that could move mountains and mend hearts. "You are my champion, Arthur," she whispered. "And you are my world, Phasma," he replied. They stood together on the balcony one last time, watching the twin suns set over the horizon of their shared home. The air was still, the only sound the gentle hum of the city below and the rhythmic breathing of two people who had changed the course of history. The Empress and her human, a match made in the cold vacuum of space that had burned brighter than any star. Their love was the ultimate proof of humanity's excellence, a story of passion and power that would never be forgotten. The legacy lived on in their children, who possessed the violet skin of the Valyrians and the determined, kinetic eyes of their father. They were a new species, born of human ingenuity and alien grace, a living bridge between the stars. And as the story of Arthur and Phasma was told to the next generation, it always began with the same line. The Empress laughed at the humans until she saw what they could truly do. Arthur's rifle remained in the Great Spire, a museum piece that reminded every visitor of the day the universe changed. It wasn't a weapon of war anymore, but a symbol of the moment humanity stepped onto the galactic stage and demanded to be heard. Phasma would often visit it, her fingers tracing the steel barrel just as Arthur's had so many years ago. She would smile, remembering the heat of the arena and the even greater heat of the man who had stood there. He was right, she would whisper to the silent hall. "Mass times acceleration," she would say, her eyes glowing with memory. But it was the heart that provided the velocity. She would conclude, walking back to her throne, the echoes of a human's boots following her through the corridors of time. The universe was a vast, complex place, full of wonders and terrors. But for Phasma and Arthur, it was simply the stage for a love that defied the odds and proved that sometimes, the most primitive things, a touch, a kiss, a steady heart, are the most powerful forces in existence. And in that truth, humanity found its place among the stars, not as conquerors, but as the passionate, brilliant, and utterly impressive race that changed everything. The final chapter of their lives was written in the quiet moments of a peaceful retirement on the border moons they had once fought over. They lived in a house built of wood and stone, a human design that Phasma found infinitely more comforting than the crystal palaces of her youth. They spent their days gardening, and their nights watching the stars they had once ruled. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Phasma asked, leaning against Arthur's shoulder as the first stars appeared. "It's home," Arthur replied, his hand squeezing hers. And as the darkness settled over the moon, they walked inside, their shadows merging into one, a final testament to the union that had redefined the galaxy. The Empress and the tactician, the alien and the human, together until the very end, proving that in the end, love is the only force that truly matters. Would you like me to write a sequel focusing on their children's role in the new empire?